How do you save an industrial city's declining riverside? One firm's solution was to hide the river entirely to create a new civic heart. But why? Newcastle's quayside once formed the industrial heart of the city. Before the railways, the River Tyne formed the main method for exporting and importing goods. Coal was rowed to larger vessels by keelmen to then be exported across the globe. Then came the railways, which then crisscrossed the River Tyne, the construction of the high-level bridge making change tangible. The city's relationship with the river began to alter, the railways providing competition to the vessels beneath. The high-level bridge was followed by the King Edward VII Bridge, cementing Newcastle as a railway city. In 1928, a new road bridge over the Tyne would change the rhetoric again. The age of the motor car would see the presence of the river diminish further, with more goods transported by road. Another blow to Newcastle's quayside was the growing size of the vessels, which began favouring deep water ports, usually located away from towns and cities. Up until the 1950s, raw sewage would flow into the River Tyne. Harsh chemicals from the industries lining the banks of the Tyne would also enter the river, and salmon numbers in the river were dropping. The River Tyne was not a pleasant place, with an effluent smell reported at this time. By the 1960s, the quayside was in a declining state. The industrial sheds and warehouses lining its banks were seeing less use. The ornate stone offices of the shipping companies that lined the north bank of the River Tyne were an edifice of a bygone era. Sir Basil Spence, when designing his own failed scheme for the quayside, would say, "The Tyne is a marvellous masculine river, typically North British. I hope it will never be tarted up with tulips and the like." It was clear that something was needed to be done to halt the decline of the quayside. The poor river quality made this an unpleasant area to spend much time. A vision for transforming this area would come from an architecture firm formed by two men, one local to the region, the other not. John Gordon Ryder was born in Teesside in 1919. Ryder went to King's College in Newcastle to read architecture and later also studied town planning as a postgraduate. Peter Yates was born in Essex, originally working as an artist before turning to architecture in 1938. During the war, as part of the Allied Expeditionary Force liberating Paris, Yates sought out Le Corbusier. Upon finding him, what started was a lifelong friendship. Ryder and Yates would cross each other's paths whilst working on a new town in the northeast of England. The new town of Peterlee, located to the south of Sunderland, was created under the 1948 New Towns Act, designed to relocate residents away from the declining pitheads and towards a new town with community at its heart. Peterlee was a radical solution for an area suffering industrial decline. Ryder and Yates wrote of the proposed new town, designed by surveyor C.W. Clark. His proposal was to develop at high density one town which would form a centre to the circle of collieries. These settlements, as Monica Felton said, are neither town nor village. They are mining camps, but camps built with a terrifying permanence. The site chosen for the new town was superb, a natural marvel comparable with Durham and the major sites of Europe, and an unspoiled, little-known lost world in a shallow saucer completely containing its own landscape. Gordon Ryder applied for a role working on the new town and was said to be the only candidate from the northeast. Peter Yates would also be separately appointed to a role within the team. They worked alongside Berthold Lübeking in preparing plans for the original master plan at Peterlee. This would have seen a series of tower blocks built on the site. However, the history of coal mining on the site would mean this scheme would be unfeasible. The story of Peterlee, whilst informative, served more as a training ground for Ryder and Yates, who learned lots from Lübeking. In 1958, After their work on Peterlee, Ryder and Yates was formed. Their designs focused on the principles of modernism. Their original works were a series of private houses across the northeast. However, as their reputation began to grow, they constructed a significant number of buildings. But what they proposed next would be a leap beyond any firm's experience. Back to the River Tyne, which in 1969 was in a poor state. The Newcastle quayside and surroundings were in a state of decline. Ryder and Yates would offer a solution for a new civic heart for Tyneside. On a site now bookended by the Millennium Bridge and the Swing Bridge, a vision for the future of the quayside would be developed, a concrete deck stretching over the Tyne. The deck would feature a concert hall, public buildings and restaurants. This would have been a new civic and cultural heart for the region. The project aimed to unite Newcastle and Gateshead into one city, Tyneside. Large vessels would have been prevented from going up the river by the deck, with smaller boats able to get through underneath the deck. The upper part of the river would have been converted into an inland lake. Important additions included a helipad and office towers lining the banks of the Tyne. But this project was never built. But was it ever meant to be? The Tyne Deck was a statement of the political ideals of the time, showing the North East could do something truly radical, a thought piece to rethink this area of the city, a notion of turning its back on the industries which formed it, and instead transforming into a commercial city. And this was 20 years before the rest of the city followed this idea. The banks of the River Tyne would not be regenerated for another 20 years after the Tyne Deck plan. Ryder and Yates noticed the unique potential of this space to serve as a civic or cultural centre for Newcastle and Gateshead. The enormity of the funding required to redevelop Newcastle quayside would be a challenge to overcome in later years. Numerous plans were drawn up for this area, but it would take a development corporation set up by national government, known as the Tyne and Weir Development Corporation, to actually change the tide. A master plan designed by Sir Terry Farrell would be the one which finally came to fruition. A series of office blocks following the curve of the River Tyne, set back from the river's edge. The main benefit of this scheme was the individual building plots, allowing this to be developed over time, a process which is still ongoing. Newcastle and Gateshead would never get the unity of being one city under Tyneside. Instead, the arbitrary boundary of local authorities through the River Tyne would divide local politics. It's clear that the ideas of Ryder and Yates have lived on in some form. The cultural functions of the Tyne Deck have been split off and built along the banks of the river. The law courts for Newcastle would be built in 1990. An art gallery would open in the former Baltic Flour Mill in 2002. A concert hall would be built down here in 2004, known as the Glass House. The offices proposed around St Mary's Church would be built in a greatly reduced scale in the 1960s and 70s, with a new wave of offices actually built under Terry Farrell's master plan in the 1990s. Bars and restaurants have opened in the old buildings, and an arena has been mooted for the site next door for decades, still yet to be built. If the Tyne Deck got anything right, it was identifying the land uses for this area of the city. The River Tyne was still navigable upstream of Newcastle for decades after the Tyne Deck plan, although the closures of the Staiths, Vickers Armstrong and Stella Power Station meant that big ships would no longer need to travel up the river. The breakdown of the Swing Bridge would now be the preventer of big ships travelling upstream. Not that they have any reason to go upstream now. The Tyne and Weir County Council, formed in 1974, would offer some resemblance to a unified region, but after this was dissolved in 1986, the new North East Combined Authority would not have a commissioned office block on the Tyne Deck. Instead, they just let office space from Newcastle City Council. The Tyne Deck as a thought piece has served its purpose. 50 years on, this still invokes conversations about about the past and future of the quayside.